welcome back to Exeter and Laira. You're watching part 9 of the build series, and as you can see I've been relatively busy trying to bring together the North End scenics. So sit back and enjoy. This is a relatively long video, but in it I'm going to go through how I've done all my track ballasting, weathering, and as well as the level crossing, all the scenics at the back as well. As always, at the end, any questions or comments, please do drop them down in the comment section, and I'll do my very best to answer whatever I can. So here we are, finally at the stage where I can now really start getting into the serious parts of the scenery. Seems to have taken forever to get here. Obviously little bits and pieces like the road surfaces are all done, and the scratch builds at the back there. But now we can really start building up everything else in this whole North End area. Now the plan is to actually do this over 3 videos, as it's quite a big area, roughly about 5 feet by 3 foot, and I'm going to work from the level crossing, this area here, all the way back, and everything from the track work to the back scene. So we're going to concentrate on everything around where the sheds are. So that's all the trains away, the power's now switched off, and so let's make a start. Now there's areas in between points and joins of track where there's no sleepers, so there we go, that's all those now in position, and I've also glued down a piece of ball head track in that area there. It only goes so far into the shed, and likewise at the back another piece just added on there. And again, that doesn't actually go anywhere, but it's there as a cosmetic detail, and none of it's ever going to be used, so it won't be wired up in any way. So as we move towards doing the track work on the layout, I've done a couple of sample pieces on a piece of plywood, and it's always worth popping out into the real world and checking out track that you're trying to model, and get an idea of what tones and colours and textures that you may well see through obviously the ballasting, the weathering, the sleepers, the rails themselves, and just sort of get a good idea of the tones and colours that you can see. So to achieve the finish that I've done on here, I've also taken sort of obviously lots of reference pictures from quite old videos and photos on Google and stuff like that, to try and get an idea what the track work was like in the sort of early 90s period. Now Exeter and Laira does have quite a large number of ball head track in around the station, as well as some very small areas of concrete sleeper in some of the areas just near around by the level crossing. So what I try and aim to do is to sort of have a good look at the track that I'm trying to model, and work my way through all the tones and grime and textures, and see, kind of get an idea of how to build it back up again, starting from the beginning. So what I'm going to try and do is, or what I've actually done on this, is actually to break the weathering stages up into 2 halves. So I'll do a degree of sort of painting and weathering before I ballast. Obviously put down the ballast and then do another load of weathering to the ballast once that's down. So the first thing I actually do is to actually paint all the sleepers, and what I do with the concrete sleeper ones is I use a couple of Revel aqua colours, which are beige, and these are mixed up as a 50-50 ratio, and that gives you a nice sort of soft cream colour, which kind of really does look like concrete sleeper type colour. For the wooden sleepers I use just some raw umber acrylic paint, and all the wooden sleepers are covered completely in this, and this isn't too far away from what the sleepers are, sort of the actual plastic colour finish on them. And on top of that, I always look down at the rails and try and work out the tones and the colours and strip those back to what they would be in their original sort of, I suppose, rust finish. Most track is normally delivered on site fairly rusty, and I've picked up these little pots of Vallejo paints, and this is probably the closest one I could get to something that resembles the rust on the rails before any other weathering tones and colours are added. And then once all this has dried, I then go over the whole lot with a diluted acrylic white, and that's normally just syringed over in random areas, and then just with a big chunky brush, something similar to this, is then just stipple the actual white paint down into the sleepers. And this is where it's vital that you use this acrylic on the, obviously, the sleepers. In fact, it's more vital to use obviously the paint on the sleepers because it holds down any weather washes rather than dispersing over the plastic sleepers. Once the whole lot's dried, I then go over all the track with just some Humbrol acrylic varnish, and that will seal down all the acrylic paints. Obviously, because we're going to be using a lot of water to put PVA mixtures down into the ballast, that could potentially strip off some of the actual paint that's on the sleepers and the rails. So the next stages of building up the scenery here, it has to be all the line side detail. So that could be anything from the concrete line side cable trunking, relay boxes, manhole covers, and even like the orange pipes that you see go through the tracks to carry all the electrical cables. All that sort of stuff you want to put into consideration before even thinking about laying any ballast. Another one's normally signals as well, but as my signals are actually on the ends of my platforms, I don't need to worry about that aspect of the build at this stage. So what I've done is I've picked myself up a few packs of these scale model scenery concrete line side cable trunking. I've also picked up some of the orange tubing that you find that goes underneath the track and carries all the cables, and some manhole covers as well. On top of those, I've also picked up a few packs of the relay boxes, and going to start building these up and then getting them weathered, and we'll start putting them in position where I think all this stuff goes. So the plan that with what I'm going to do with these actual kits is I'm not actually going to use the whole of it, so I'm not going to build up the whole kit. I'm actually specifically want the lids more than anything, and the reason being is when we check the landscape at Exeter and David's, all the areas in between the rails, so these areas here where I've got the line side trunking, and also as well to the front area of the car park, the ground level's a lot lower, and the actual cable trunking itself is actually sunk down into the ground opposed to being sort of up. And then you've got the ballast. Most people would obviously lay the ballast to their track and then take it all the way to the edge of where their line side trunking is. However, it's not like that at St David's. You'll see as I progress on with building up the scenery in this area that it's I only actually mainly need the lids in this area. So this is how I'm going to do this. What I've got is some decorator's cork, and going to apply a very thin bead running along the back of here. Now I want to try and get it so it's not dead flat to the ground. The idea of this is to make the lids have a bit of unevenness to them, so I'll grab out a couple. What I'll do is I'll start the process of laying these so that's those all in, and you really do get a sense of the realism now, as it's none of it's straight, it's all over the place, and it's kind of just how it would be in real life. Okay, so we've got all the line side detail all installed, and that's been given plenty of time to dry. I've also started laying the sub base for the level crossing. I'll come back to this later in the video and go into that into more detail. But for now, I'm going to make a start on filling in the areas in between the actual lines, and I'll show you the bits and pieces I'm going to use for doing that. So I'm going to be working in areas in between the two sets of cable trunking, and getting all the ground stuff all filled in between all the main lines. And what I'm going to use for that is, rather than using ballast, which seems to be the popular choice, I'm going to actually use calci sand. Now this is available from most pet shops, or this is actually chinchilla sand, but it's a nice fine plain dry sand, a couple of quid a bag. I think I paid about £1 for that bag, and you get quite a bit in there. Now I've also mixed some of this up with a quantity of grey tile grout, just to give it more variation in colour. To stick all this down, I'm just going to use some Mod Podge glue, and I've got my first pile of sand already in the Ascent shakers. These are Woodland Scenics shakers, and they're pretty useful as you've got the different settings on the lid. Now I'm going to apply the glue straight from the pot, and I'm going to apply it quite thick in all the areas where it needs to be. Once the sand's been layered over the top of the glue, I'm going to then tamper it down so it's relatively flat, and then over the top of the glue I'll go back over that with a diluted mix of Mod Podge glue, about 50-50%, 50-50 part water, part glue, with a drop of washing out liquid in that, and I will sort of syringe that over the sand. Okay, so we've now left all the glue mix to dry overnight on the ground coverage between the tracks, and that's now completely dry. As it's nice and warm up in the loft, that doesn't take long at all. Now, one of the things I've done just underneath the piping that goes underneath the track up is I've just slid a small piece of plastic card underneath these just to bring the level of those up, otherwise they're going to get swamped in ballast. For my ballast, what I'm going to be using is the medium ballast from Woodland Scenics, and I've chosen to use two different colours. Now I've got the buff colour and I've got the grey blend. Now the reason I'm going to be using the two colours is I've got to keep in mind that a lot of this end of the station was altered, which means that there's a mixture of stuff which is a lot newer. Say from down this end there'll be a lot of the point work and track work was actually changed 6 years prior to what the date of this layout set. If we move down this end of the layout, a lot of the track work down this end would be untouched and would just be in something older. On top of the Woodland Scenics ballast, I'm also going to use the sand. Now I'm going to mix this, as I've already done in this little pot here, with the grey blend ballast. So what this will do, this will give you the finer particles that you often see in a lot of the ballast. As the age of ballast progresses, you get a lot of the finer and small particles mixed in within the actual normal ballast itself. So this is a ratio of about sort of 70% of the actual ballast and about 30%. You can increase or decrease those the quantities, and I find that some of the lines, like this line here, which is a kind of a siding that goes into a yard, the ballast is going to be pretty much non-existent. It's going to be more like a kind of more fine particles, so I'll increase the sand into the ballast on things like these sort of areas here. Likewise, what I've done at the back already, that's already been laid, and I'll use obviously the higher ballast ratio on probably up to about this point here before we sort of start moving in down this end, where I'll start kind of mixing up around the various tones. Now the grey stuff I'm going to use as an addition to sort of sprinkle on top to make it look like various bits of track work's been changed. Though most of this will be heavily weathered down, as it's a diesel period, means there's a lot of grime on the track at the time. Hopefully the two together will give a good contrast. For setting the ballast, once it's done, you can either use isopropyl alcohol or just ordinary tap water, and I'm going to be using a diluted mix of Mod Podge glue, which is 1 part Mod Podge to 2 parts water, that ratio, and that will be syringed on at the end. Now it's vital with all my track work that I want to try and create a ballast shoulder, which is pretty much stops to the edge around about here, leaving all the sand at a lower level than what the actual ballast shoulder is. So before you get started with any track weathering, it's always good just to have a good look around, try and get an idea of the actual prototype track that you actually want to model your layout to. Checking out some of the images that I've seen around Exeter St David's in the early 90s period. I have noticed that a lot of the ballast itself is of quite of a dark brown colour. There is also that sort of tinge of pinky red to it as well, which I think is pretty common for the ballast in that location. But for the best of it, it is a very dark brown, and with a lot of oil and grime from obviously the diesel locomotives that would be using the route on a regular basis. Now there are many ways of weathering your track. You can use stuff like weathering powders, you can dry brush, you can paint obviously different colours onto your ballast. Airbrushing is another good way. Fair few people would obviously use an airbrush. Now my weathering process is going to be broken up into two halves. Obviously I can't do too much at one go. The way I'm going to do this is to use the first two colours of burnt umber and raw umber. Now the actual burnt umber itself I will actually apply first, and the raw umber will go on second. Now these are going to be diluted down, so they're quite runny, probably about a 50-50 mix of I suppose equal parts paint to equal parts water, enough for it to break the surface with a drop of washing up liquid. Should be able to break the surface and soak down through the ballast. That will give me the orangey tinges that you get in the ballast. The raw umber itself will give me the darker shades of brown, and that will be applied as a second coating once I've done this particular shade first. Okay, so now with all the ballasting well and truly in and completely dry, there are, as I said, a few areas which will need patching up again, but for the best of it, it'll do for now, and I can come back to those after I've done the first stages of weathering. Okay, so starting off with the burnt umber colour, which gives me that sort of terracotta red. I'm just literally just going to get that down through the ballast. And it really doesn't matter if you get it all over the sleepers, that just adds more grime to the actual sleepers themselves. Now it will hover on the surface for a little while, but eventually it'll break down and eventually head its way down through the ballast. And of course, it doesn't matter if it's on top of the sleepers, as there's other tones and colours to go on top of it as well. Now I try and keep it so it's just within the margins of the where the sleepers end, and the key to it is not to over apply it, because it will eventually spread its way out further away from the track itself. So in this case, less is more. Okay, so into the darker brown, and I'm just going to work this down into the ballast as well. And this will eventually just take that uniform finish away, so you don't end up with everything just looking too one coloured. Of course, I've got the mixture of the ballast as well. And the mixtures of the paints should all give a nice weathered finish. So that's the first stages of the weathering well underway, and now I'm going to leave that to completely dry, which overnight should be sufficient enough. And going to come back tomorrow, and just like the real railways, all the little patches that need filling in can be done, and the engineering train's there already and chucks most of its ballast out all over the track. Okay, so I'm now ready for the final stages of weathering, and the first thing I'm going to focus on is actually the rails themselves. And now typically most people would use something like a sleeper grime type colour. I find those little pots probably not great value for money in terms of what you can just mix up easily enough. Again, just check the reel well and you'll get an idea of the colours that are out there. So I'm going to use a nice healthy dollop of raw umber, and just to tone it away from the brown ever so slightly, I'm just going to use some cheap Hobbycraft black paint, and I'm just going to apply a tiny amount like that, and that will just differ the tones a little bit. On top of that as well, I'm going to put a very minute drop of white, mix the two together, and that should give you something that's kind of a nice sleeper grime type colour. The solution itself has been diluted down. I want to try and aim for something that's pretty similar to single cream. You want to be able to make it flow over the sort of ballast and sleepers, and obviously stick enough to the rails, enough for it to be visible, but also translucent, so you can still sort of make out bits of the rust through the actual sleeper grime colour. So I've now patched up all the areas where there was a few low spots or bits that were deliberately missed, and just used the grey blend all down this end, likewise up this end. That's all been patched up, and I've actually just used the buff, and along this section here I added a little bit more of the way of the sand to give more of a finer particle on this section here. So say at this stage it's doesn't matter if you go over the tops of the sleepers or it runs down into the ballast, that's perfectly fine. Go around, give the whole lot a good coat of this. So there's an example of the effects that you get. Again, doesn't matter if you go too heavy, that's perfectly fine, but when you compare it with the ones that haven't been done, it really does begin to bring it all together. So I'm going to crack on with doing all this. As I've got quite a fair few points, this is a bit time consuming to do all the points, so I'll come back and show you the next stages once these rails are done. Okay, so next stages of the actual weathering, I've taken the actual mixture that I did for the rails and I've diluted that down and added a very tiny drop of washing up liquid, and I've now got this so it's a nice watery mix, and I'm going to focus on this area as there's a few small areas of concrete sleeper. I'm just going to focus on the concrete sleeper area and actually get the dirt down between those, as I don't particularly want to get too much on the sleepers. For the wooden ones, doesn't matter, the colour will actually add a bit more variation to the actual sleepers. Now it's also important not to overdo this. It's all too easy to think that it's not actually doing anything, and the colour does intensify as it completely dries, so keep that in mind. If you stand back and you think, well, that's not done a lot, just leave it to dry and then come back possibly the following day and you can always go over it again. So that's all had the sleeper grime wash pushed down into the ballast, and as I said, it doesn't make much of a difference, or it doesn't enhance it enough. You can wait for it to dry, possibly go over it again, but as I say, do wait for it to dry before making that decision. Now once you let the sleeper grime colour dry, come back to it and make up another solution of black. Now this is, I tend to make this a little bit thicker, as technically it's the oil that you'd see in between the rails that would have come off all the locomotives. Key to this is not to go too heavy with it. I mean, you can do random areas, so I'll say round by point work. You get all the grime and oil off the points. And that, as I say, will work its way down through the ballast. And if you feel that you've overdone it a bit too much, not to worry. If you leave it to dry, there is a good way of toning it back down again. So for toning down, same kind of nice runny solution of single cream in white. And if you just syringe that down into, if you've gone a bit heavy-handed with the black, again, try not to overdo it because it will spread its way out through the sides. Also as well, the white comes in handy for picking out detail on sleepers as well. So you can go across and randomly select some of the wooden sleepers and just apply some of the white to this, and as this dries you'll end up with some really interesting effects. And of course some of the detail of the sleepers will be enhanced, and you get that contrast between the actual sleepers and the ballast, which you see quite often on the real railways. So that's pretty much it for this. Going to leave this to dry. You know, as I say, there's always opportunity to come back and, you know, add a bit more weathering tones, or to also knock it back ever so slightly. And as I say, with the sleepers you can always add various different colours. I mean, you can go into some reds or some yellows just to enhance things a little bit further. But I've got to openly admit, I think I'll probably surprise myself on this. Really pleased with exactly how that's turned out. So if we take a look at the level crossing and how I constructed it, if you remember earlier on in the video, I'd already laid the base structure for this, just to allow for exactly getting the ballast and stuff laid to it, rather than going straight through with the ballast and then trying to build on top of it. It makes sense to get it down first. The first 3 layers, they were put in place, and that just brings me up to the height of the sleepers. Since then the 4th layer has gone on top, which is the final road surface finish, and again this is just using the grey mount board from Scale Model Scenery, and these are 1mm thick. Just like the real thing at Exeter and David's, the actual level crossing itself is made up of individual panels which are slotted in between the road segments and the actual rails, and again with one laid down in the middle. So I spent a bit of time having a look through the ones that are in place today and the ones that were in place back in the early 90s, and the ones in the 90s look like they were one whole panel, possibly made from a steel cast box, and then they were filled with either tarmac or concrete. They're similar today, even though the actual panels themselves are very small segments rather than one great big long one. So to make these, what I've done is just using the grey board. These were painted in either a concrete or a tarmac type colour, and they've been cladded with some 1mm by 0.4mm thick plasticard, which was sprayed silver before being glued around the outside edges. It's always worth noting as well, if you're fitting a level crossing, is to make sure you've got adequate clearance from the end of these type of panels to your rails. Otherwise your wheels will foul these panels and make it difficult for trains to pass over. Also as well, I've painted the sleepers black. It's always a good idea to do this, because if you don't, you end up seeing obviously the cork or the baseboards below, and that looks very unrealistic and can actually spoil the effects as well. With the concrete sleeper ones, when I come to put the middle panels in, I'm going to lay some 0.5mm thick plastic card through the middle, as the concrete sleepers are dipped in the middle, which means that these panels will sit lower and not exactly flush. So just to bring the height of those up, there's just a say piece of plastic card laid across the centre, this lowered on top, and then it'll give you a nice even flat finish all the way along.